Hello and welcome to an episode of Atomic Vinyl Reviews. My name's Jacob and today we're doing a full, in-depth review and look at the enigmatic Bootleg Showa King Ghidorah 1964 MonsterArts King Ghidorah. Now, interestingly enough, we don't really know if this is indeed a bootleg of a MonsterArts figure. So another way we could really name this thing is a third-party figure. Now, the reason being, for the most part, when you think of a bootleg figure, what you think of is a specific copy of an existing figure. However, at this point in time, there is actually no direct evidence to suggest that this figure, or no, confirmed announcement that there is an actual King Ghidorah 1964 MonsterArts figure in the works, coming out or announced, or any of that stuff. Now, you might be saying, Jacob, wasn't there that tweet or post by Bluefin where somebody messaged them, and by the way, Bluefin is the distributor for MonsterArts figures in the US, I believe. But yeah, there was a message sent to them with a picture of one of these, and it said something like, well, when are we going to see something like this? And their reply was very soon. However, it's been confirmed that that was a mishap on Bluefin's part, and actually they misunderstood that to either mean like the 2019 figure or something else entirely. Regardless, to this day, we still don't know where this figure came from. I personally think for sure this must be a MonsterArts unreleased figure, just because of the sheer quality, design, and engineering of the figure, and just the uncanny sort of detailing of the sculpt. Just, oh, it feels so much like a MonsterArts, guys. Like, I have no doubt in my mind, but, you know, there's always doubt. But yeah, let's get right into it. So, these things, you can get them off of places like eBay, AliExpress, and there's a couple of other sites where you can get stuff directly from China. I recommend eBay. It's the safest place to get them from. You can use PayPal, like good stuff, and you get like a pretty good guarantee that if you get bad quality products, then you can get a refund, all that good stuff. An interesting thing about these figures in particular is the brand that they come from is called Legend Creation, or at least the brand that comes in the boxed versions. Now, my one didn't come with a box. I am actually getting the boxed version for reasons which I explained in the unboxing of this figure, but mainly just because I tried to get a more expensive version of this figure when it first came out. It came in the box because there was no other listings for it. Then I tried to cancel that order, but in the meantime I bought the cheaper version, which was on eBay, but the cancellation failed, so now I'm getting two. So I don't know what I'm going to do with that one. I might customize one, keep one stock, or I might try and sell it, or customize both and try and sell one of them customized, or something interesting like that. We'll see. If you're interested in one of these, maybe message me. I don't know. I don't know yet. That one still hasn't arrived. But yeah, the boxed versions come in an interesting box, which are actually a bootleg box of the 2019 Ghidorah. Because yes, in fact, all the listings, pretty much, as far as I've gathered, for the 2019 Ghidorah on those bootleg sites like AliExpress, or the ones that are oddly cheap, seem to just be this thing. And it's reflected in that box design, which I'll put up on screen now. And it is clearly reflected in the color choice that they made in the paintwork of this figure, right down to, you know, almost the exact same color of the figure and the placement of the colors. For example, instead of being a luscious gold color, or like just, you know, something that really reflects the color of this design in the film. So he wasn't, you know, the most bright gold, but he was definitely metallic in that film, and more of a yellowy, more brighter color. He's a very beige-brown, dull color, which is almost identical to the color of the figure from the 2019 King Ghidorah, the MonsterArts figure, I should specify. And it's even reflected in the airbrushing, I should say, that they've done along these spines, along the fan-like wings. That's almost identical to the placement of the paint on the other figure, the 2019 figure, which I will bring in later. It's very huge, that figure, so it's really hard to show you guys immediately, but right now we'll just get through this. And some paintwork around the crotch area, around the legs, and a bit on the knees, and a big stripe down the back, as well as the lack of paint on the backs of the wings, and the use of some brighter paint, some more bright yellow paint, on his horns, and I think, is it on his toenails? It might be, it might not be. Yeah, there is a little bit of a more yellowy color on his claws down there. Yeah, sculpt-wise, let's get into this stuff. So, you may be asking, it's a bootleg, how good could a figure like this be? Like, obviously it's going to be falling apart, the sculpt's going to be, you know, a mess and not as detailed and all that sort of stuff, and I'm actually genuinely pleasantly surprised by this thing. Now, I have reviewed the special color version MonsterArts bootleg, which is probably also from Legend Creation, as well as the Godzilla 2019 bootleg figure with the weird gnarly teeth. I'm still yet to release my unboxing of that, but the boxed version of those also comes from Legend Creation. Interestingly enough, so so I guess we can call this line of MonsterArts fakes Legend Creation King Ghidorahs and Godzilla and all that sort of stuff, which is another supporting factor in why I think this one is actually a MonsterArts bootleg, since all of these seem to be actual MonsterArts bootlegs, but just speculation at this point. But yeah, I've reviewed this figure, actually no, not this figure, which is actually a mishmash of the actual 1991 King Ghidorah MonsterArts sculpt for the wings, the heads, and the tail tips. However, the bulk of this figure, so the legs, the body, the tails, and all the necks are identical in sculpt to this thing, and I was also initially really surprised at the quality of this one. And the same thing goes for this figure here. Aside from the, you know, the really odd paintwork, quality-wise and sculpt-wise, this thing is really exceptional for a bootleg figure. So we'll put this guy aside, because I've talked about him enough in my other videos. But just in terms of the sculpt and the engineering on this guy, it is very, very good. Before we get into the sculpt and the details, I'll just kind of show off some of his articulation, which I actually find really impressive. And because I'm going to change the setup on my camera a little bit so it can zoom into macro to look at that sculpt. But for now, especially the necks on this thing are actually really, really well done. Now, I actually have the 1991 King Ghidorah MonsterArts figure, and that one falls apart all the time, and it cannot get the same poses as this thing can out of its necks. Now look at this, you can do anything with this guy's necks, and the ball joints are actually really decent. And look at that, he's just doing a whirly whoop here. You can get his necks to bend back really far, like so. You can probably tie them together if you really bloody hell wanted to, almost. I don't know, but look. They feel really solid, and the sculpt on these necks really holds together nicely when you bend them. So that part of the articulation is phenomenal. I did have some minor issues with some of the joints being a little bit stuck when I first got him, so nothing was falling off or too loose, thankfully. That's a really big plus for this thing, because most actual MonsterArts figures have issues with joints falling off. However, I did have some issues with some of the hip joints kind of not working as well, and some of these little leg segments when you tried to bend them. You could feel the little barbell joint kind of trying to bend instead of the actual joint moving. However, it is a very, very easy fix for that. You simply get your hairdryer to blast heat at it, and you heat it up, and you just work the joints slowly, and they really liven up after that, and then you can really work this figure without a problem after that. So you can get all manner of kind of articulation out of the legs. You can move it any way you really want to. He's got quite chunky legs, so he moves about just as well as any other Godzilla type kaiju figure with really big legs. But you know, you can do all sorts of interesting things. Jesus, I really got to be careful with these wings in this review. This one in particular, the other one seems to stick on pretty well. But yeah, if you are having, you know, if you're just sitting him on on a desk or something and not really messing about with him, the wings aren't an issue at all with falling off. But just now, this one seems to be in particular falling off. But yeah, speaking of the wings actually have a really interesting articulation point. So you can see they have a little bit of it visible on the sides here. From the front, it's almost invisible, that little joint there. But I'll just briefly show that to you guys, how these joints operate. So they peg on. This one's actually stuck on really firmly. Okay, there we go. So you see these wings. It's a little blurry, but there is like an opening in the side there. And they have a specific shape which locks in to these little pieces here. Now they have the ability for this little flap to go up and down this way, on a little swivel there, and on the side here, like you can see there, they go this way, but they can also, let me just have a look, yeah, they can also move up like this. So there is a part of this joint which allows it to move up this way, so you can do some weird shit with the wings like that. And you can ever so slightly swivel them out like so. So they can just kind of go like this out a little bit, or you can sink them back this way. Unfortunately, when you actually have the wings on them, they barely move up this way, which is a shame because it actually looks a lot better when the wings are bent up this way, because they seem more upright. So his wings here, they look a lot nicer, a lot more lively, I feel, when they're a bit angled up like this, because they seem to droop down a little bit when you have them snugly in their little hole back here. They look more like this, and they just don't seem as nice. But however, articulation-wise, not the worst kind of system. Like, the wings are a little bit harder to move on this one than the special color bootleg, which I got here, which have the same joints, but for some reason they seem to flow a little bit, move around a little bit better on this one. So your mileage may vary with this. And in general, again, this is a bootleg figure, so in general, I cannot attest to how good their quality control is. I will, of course, review or do a quick sort of unboxing video of the second one and let you know how it compares to this first one to see how consistent they are quality-wise. Another interesting thing articulation-wise is obviously the mouth does open on these. However, it is very subtle, unfortunately. They seem nice and firm and they don't fall off the mouths like they do on the 90s MonsterArts, but they only kind of just ever so slightly do that. Like, perhaps you could force the thing open a little wider. But yeah, not much. So this guy can only bitty a little bit. Or at least as much as his mouth will allow. But yeah, his tongues are also appear to be not articulated. They just seem to be attached to the bottom of his mouth here, but we'll have a look at that closer up later on. His tails articulate really well as well. They're very smooth in their movements. I did have some issues when I was with these sort of pieces closer to the base of the tail when I was trying to heat them up to get them to move. I didn't quite get them perfectly done, and in fact I had a bit of an issue where I think the paint was making it stick a little bit to the actual joint here, even when I was like heating it up, so it was slightly tearing a little bit of the plastic. I was able to carefully just make it function without tearing anything really badly or anything like that, but it was just about to start, so be careful with that. Another thing, when I first pulled this out of the box, I said, oh god, it smells really strong, plasticky, like gasoline. That passed really quickly. I think that was more just the box than it was the figure. So right now it's all good, no fumes or anything like that. Pretty much just as much as any average MonsterArts figure would right out of the box. He also has a joint around the waist here, so he can move back pretty far. Most people have him posed, kind of slouched down in lots of stock images, and I find that looks a little bit, I find that looks a little bit worse than him when he's posed, you know, more upright. It looks a little bit more grand. That's just how I like to have him posed, because he looks a little bit more, you know, ready for battle that way. But yeah. So, before we get on to a closer look at this thing, I'll quickly show you his accessories. So, he does indeed come with a flight stand. Funny thing is, this is the Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah flight stand, clearly a bootleg of the MonsterArts 1991 one, even down to the licensing info below. It's identical, and the same stand came with the bootleg special color version that I keep bringing up. But yeah, you just assemble this thing. It comes in 3 pieces, has the main stand here with a little bit of a clicky joint there. This bit slips onto here, I think. It takes a little bit of effort to stick it on, but there we go. And that's where Ghidorah would rest. This was built to fit the 1991 King Ghidorah, so it won't fit this guy like flush, but it does work. I've tried it with the other figure, so this you kind of just have to push in quite firmly, and it should lock in eventually. And there we go. A little bit of a plastic stand for this Ghidorah, and we'll quickly. Sorry, I can't talk today. It's just been that kind of a day, guys. But yeah, you can quickly put him in here, and he should just rest on that, and if the stand is built to any quality, he shouldn't fall over, hopefully. So you may have to tighten, there's a little screw down here on this little ratcheting part, because it is kind of wobbling here on this part here. It was a bit more solid on my other one, but this one, you know, you can get it to function after a while. But I would not leave this figure on this stand unless you really secure it, and you know, you have to be confident in it yourself. I couldn't do that. I'm kind of worried. It does look really nice though in this pose, actually. Just giving you guys a little quick look at that. Alright, so hopefully here you can get a good sense of this guy's sculpt. So you can see he's got these brilliant little very Showa-esque heads. They did a really good job at matching the look from that original series of this guy, because he's got a very distinct look to his faces. Now, I'm not entirely too keen about the exact paintwork that they chose for the eyes and the nose, but from, you know, in person it does look a lot better, I'd say, than it does looking at it here now. You can see they even sculpted in his little manes here. I think they could have done a little bit of a better job sort of adding a little bit more detail into that mane. However, perhaps if that were painted a slightly more brown tint, it would really show up a lot more nicely. Maybe if you added some dry brushing over that as well, to really bring out the details that are there. I really love these sort of very Eastern Dragon-like designs. They did a really great job with actually painting in the mouths and the teeth. They did that quite cleanly. The eyes, like I said, they kind of outline them really weirdly with the black paint, which kind of looks a bit funny. And some of them are done better than others. Some are a little messy, but for a bootleg, not too bad. Now, there is a slight bit of shading that goes on these fin horns here. I really love these horns, and they're very well done, and they look really, really cool. But they go over it with sort of a lighter color, as you can hopefully make out there. They have a slightly lighter brown, yellowy, almost white color, and it looks a little bit rough. It's not done as smoothly as, especially like this beautiful airbrushing that they did on the wings. Now, aside from the color of the wings being off, like he should have gold wings, the way they painted them and the way they're sculpted is beautiful. The sculpt on these things, just like the actual MonsterArts 1991 wings, these ones, they just look so real, like it's an actual membrane of material between these, the ribbing in his fan-like wings. That looks so good, actually. And you can come in closer, you can see he's got a much more smooth plating than the 90s Ghidorah down his neck. These are more finer, smooth, little under neck plating. And the scaling all over this guy is really immaculate. So these scales are done beautifully. They're slightly, ever so slightly smaller than the one on the 90s Ghidorah, which is accurate to this guy in the film. He actually had very sort of slightly rough-looking scales that kind of shook about as he moved. And they were much smaller as well, just like on this figure. And you can see he has a big, sort of much wider chest, which is very accurate to that Ghidorah. that, you know, goes down a little bit lower, closer to where his legs start in the bulky area, which is very accurate to the 64 Ghidorah. We even have some kind of, you can see all these little lines, kind of indents on his body, which really reflect kind of the indents that the actual suit would have, making it a lot more suit accurate, which is really awesome. And then hopefully you can kind of make it out here. There's a particularly visible one. You can see there the joint for this wing is barely visible on this side, and like I said, when you turn it around on this side, you can definitely make out these joints. So you can kind of see these ones don't flow as well as the joints on my other figure, but I think if you just keep applying heat, that will help. But it's also pretty good that they are firm, except for this wing, which in this review has really been a nuisance, but like I said, up until now it hasn't been, so that's kind of odd. The wingtips also have much longer, more hook-like claws, which surprisingly, none of which arrived broken. They all came intact, and they look beautiful. So that's really, really great. I love these crescent moon shapes that this Ghidorah has. I kind of wish more incarnations of Ghidorah would have this, because it's such a really nice feature that I bloody well love about this design in particular. So moving down here, he has slightly longer legs than the 90s Ghidorah. I will bring them in together later on, but just kind of letting you know, slightly longer legs. You can see how they kind of move. And again, they have that beautiful scaling down them, and a bit of that shading around this area. All the areas, even though I'm not a fan of this color, all the areas that are actually shaded do look nicely painted. Like, it looks complete in a way. Whereas when you turn around to the back of the wings, they look so bland without any paintwork, whereas the front of them, that just looks gorgeous, doesn't it? But one of the little negatives about this figure is his claws seem a little bit on the sort of rounded side. They don't quite look as sharply sculpted as, say, the rest of the scaling, which is done very evenly, really beautifully, and really neatly and clearly defined scales down his body, which I just love. But his feet, his claws are just kind of rounded. It almost isn't noticeable, I'd say, but it is kind of there. And he does have some seam lines around the place, which I'll kind of try to show you off later off. But if you can look under his feet here, they are kind of just done smoothly, which is different to what MonsterArts do. MonsterArts typically would have detailing under the soles of the feet of their kaiju. And he just has faintly written in an R and an L, just to signify left and right under his feet, which is also interesting. And his tails are beautifully done, much the same as they are on the 90s Ghidorah, but they are a little bit shorter. The scaling is, again, immaculate. There's no variation in these scales under the tails or any sort of plating. It's all just very fine, even scales. And the tips of his tails are tipped off with these little like structures, which are more accurate to the film as well. Now these, the detailing on these, I think it's a little bit flat. It's not as crisp or deep as it could be. But I think if you painted it up with some, like a darker wash to help bring these out, and maybe some highlights, they'd look a lot better. They look really feathery, or like little tree branches or something, which is really interesting. One other interesting point to note is actually on this wing here. Now the paintwork on the back here should be fairly nicely done. However, there was like one or two spots, like right here. So I don't know if you can see that. There's a little white mark there, and I've just noticed a little tiny one here. So I think they didn't do the best job on this wing, in particular of the paint. And there was like a little air bubble in that area where there's that white spot there. And the other day I just brushed over it gently, and that kind of revealed the white plastic underneath. So the same happened here. So it seems much better on this wing. This wing, the paint feels glossy and smooth. On this one, it feels a little bit more rough. So I don't know why that is. Maybe they just did a thinner coat on this thing or something, but this side of the back of the wing isn't as well done. However, it's a very minor thing, like these little tiny dots. You could even paint over it with like a cheap acrylic paint, which won't, like, you know, like a normal paint that you just paint for, like, on a canvas, and that should fix it up just enough for it to be to work all right on that wing. But you know, you could also do it with like a proper paint. But I think if it's just that tiny spot, you could easily touch that up. I'm actually considering repainting this thing entirely to make him properly gold and all of that. The only thing that's a bit sad is I really like that dry brushing. I keep saying dry brushing. What I really mean is airbrushing along the wings, because it just looks so nice, and I don't have an airbrush, and I'm not sure I'm really ready to invest in one just to paint one figure. But we'll see. I might paint it, I may not. So another thing, I've just brought in these faces really close. As you can quite clearly see, there are seam lines that run down the middle of his faces there. Right down. You can kind of see it between the eyes, hopefully, if that's in focus. But here we have a nice view of this guy's mouth. You can see his tongue's there. This Ghidorah kind of had two tongues. So you can kind of see there, this one looks a little bit more like a snake tongue. The divide is kind of not as clear. I'm not sure how accurate that is. But you can get a good sense of how they painted his faces here, and the eyes there in particular. The color in the nose, I kind of like that they made it darker, but I think they made it a little too dark. Again, in person, it's not as big a deal, because it's kind of diffused amongst the rest of the shadows amongst this figure in person, but just here in this lighting, it's a little bit more apparent and looks a little odd. But yeah, I would have preferred if they used more just like a brown that was a little bit darker than the actual sculpt, actual coloring of the rest of the figure, or maybe even just made the holes deeper in there, in the sculpt directly. But yeah, here you can get a good sense of what this guy looks like. Just a good look at the real detailing in the sculpt. You can see some little seam lines, like along the top of the wings here they have some faint seam lines. You can kind of make that out at the base of the tail, not the tail, the wings there. But generally speaking, there's not much in terms of real seam lines across the scaly part of his body. That's all done beautifully. You can see how even and nicely sculpted those ones are. Like you can see a little bit, where is it? Here, just there's a little bit of a line. It's so faint that you wouldn't really see it in person. Again, I have this pretty close up on film, and you can kind of get a sense of what his feet look like here, really close up. There you can kind of see them. They have those slightly more rounded claws. Again, they're not so rounded that it looks like completely out of place on this figure, but just compared to what I'd expect from a more MonsterArts type sculpt, those are a bit rounded. And we can show you these tail tips, because these, of course, are a new sculpt even from that special color version one, which uses most of the same sculpted details as this thing. So you can see there what those look like. They could have been done sharper, but again, isn't the worst. Not at all, actually. But still, you can kind of see that. Very bland, though. It's especially noticeable because these things, you kind of picture them having some highlights or some sort of shading work done on them. Also, when you get this guy out of the packaging, some of these horns may be a little bit warped or stuff like that. Again, just heat it up, move it a little bit to your preferred spacing, and then it will all be fine. But yeah, we'll get a nice look at his faces. So before we do a proper size comparison, one thing I wanted to do is just kind of show you this guy in comparison to a few figures. So I'm gonna zoom out again and bring in some other King Ghidorah figures that just to compare this guy to. So I just want to bring in this Bandai vinyl first. So this is a made in Japan Bandai vinyl, made somewhere in the 80s, and it's my only other Showa King Ghidorah figure. What's kind of interesting about this one in particular is I was expecting that this figure here would actually be smaller. The MonsterArts one, I thought it would feel smaller than this Bandai vinyl here. Interestingly enough, even though this is actually a pretty big Bandai vinyl, this MonsterArts one feels a lot bigger than it. Mainly because of Ghidorah's huge wings in this case. These wings are just massive, especially compared to the previous King Ghidorah figure, the 1991 figure. So I'll bring my one in and we'll kind of have a look at them together. So here we have the actual MonsterArts one, the original release one. So he's done in that more dull sort of gold. Has kind of issues with the wings. One of his wings is a little bit saggy. Still a great figure nonetheless. So you can see these two compared to each other. The wings on the 90s one are much more slimmed down, pointy looking, whereas the big Showa ones are just, they feel a lot fuller and are built a bit, have a bit more fullness down the bottom of the wing here. So they feel very different, and it makes this figure much bigger. It's also a very bulky figure, just with a wide chest, the bigger legs, even though the heads and the spikes on his heads and all of that are a bit smaller, and also the tails are much longer on the 90s one. Oops. And you can see bits just fall off on this 90s one willy-nilly, so it's actually surprisingly how well the ball joints hold up on this Showa Ghidorah here. But you can see the tails, there's no comparison in the length. The 90s one was built with massively long tails for some reason. Oh god, that fucking wing. Seriously, this never happened before this review. Luckily, this wing seems to be fairly decently built, because it's not breaking. But that's so annoying. So yeah, keep track of those wings. Maybe worth gluing them in, I don't know. If you're ever trying to like resell them, packaging them up and with the full wings is going to be very difficult, but maybe just like putting in something sticky in there, like glue tack or something. I don't know, that might not work very well. But yeah, moving on, we have the other bootleg, the special color version, which again has almost identical, is almost identical for most of the figure besides the wings, heads, and tail tips. So you can see the body on what the body would look like on this figure if it were painted in gold. So it looks very nice, and this figure really pops out in person. It's actually one of my favorite Ghidorah figures at the moment. I actually kind of prefer it to the actual 1991 MonsterArts figure, if I'm going to be honest at this point, just based on color alone, but it functions a lot better, so the ball joints and the mechanics of the necks especially are a little bit more advanced. Now this one has some bits that pop off a little bit easier, but this one I've had no issues with anything popping off, which is just grand. But speaking of grand, let's bring in the mother of all King Ghidorah MonsterArts figures. Oh dear god. He is a big boy. Ichni and Kevin here is a huge figure, but you can already see that the color, like I was saying earlier, is very, very similar between these two. So if I can kind of just slot him around Ghidorah's, Showa Ghidorah's wing there, you can make out the look of these figures together. Now, yeah, this guy's massive and barely holds up on its own. Even down to like the stripe on the back here, the coloring of the wings and the way it's airbrushed on the front here, and the paintwork done on the knees and around the crotch area here, just like it is on this figure, is, yeah, they identical. They really tried to paint these in the exact same style. The only difference would probably be in the faces. Actually, the inside side of the mouths is really funny because it's actually more pink on the actual MonsterArts Ghidorah. You probably can't make it out. It's going to be blurry, but he has pink inner. His mouth's, the flesh in there is very pink, whereas on this figure, it's also very pink, but it's like a more it's a more reddish, sort of more earthy pink, I feel, than the pink that they had on this figure. Now, looking at the eyes, let's see. This figure has very tiny eyes. I think they even tried to copy the eyes from this figure, the exact same colors, with the black outline and the kind of yellowish one with the little pupil in there. It's actually very similar on the Showa Ghidorah, but it's made to fit in the Showa Ghidorah's eyes. So that is bizarre as well. So I wonder what this figure would look like if they actually tried to match the real Showa Ghidorah's, what his eyes look like. Now, I don't really remember exactly what they were like. They were probably very similar to this anyway, but that would be another cool thing to do with a repaint. But I also wanted to show you what he looks like next to some Showa figures. So we got some MonsterArts 1964 Godzilla, not from the same film. This one was from Mothra vs. Godzilla, which came out earlier in the same year. He scales up alright. He looks a little small though. The main way you can tell is based on the legs, because you got to remember, there's a person in this suit, and the legs have to fit human legs. So either they've got a tiny person to play Godzilla and a massive one to play Ghidorah, or this one's a little out of scale. Same goes with some Revoltech figures like Gigan here. Beautiful little Gigan. I still need to release his unboxing video, which I filmed like maybe like 3 or 4 months ago, but I haven't released it. I'm gonna have lots of videos coming up on my channel of figures that I haven't unboxed or reviewed yet, but I filmed it ages ago, so you may see some like out-of-date videos coming up soon. Sorry about that, I have a backlog. But regardless, this guy, he's got very small legs, but it would be real. I would love, absolutely love, if one of the next figures that MonsterArts does is a Showa Gigan, because it's one of my favorite kaiju. Or a Megalon, but, you know, a Gigan would go really well with a Showa Ghidorah, like we can, you know, have here. But, you know, for a display of a Showa series, this isn't bad. I don't think it's too bad a bad thing if Ghidorah kind of is a little bit bigger than he should be, solely based on the fact that he's this huge antagonist monster anyway. But yeah, moving along from these two, I think he's actually designed to scale up with a figure that's more in line with the size of these types of figures. So here we have the 54 Godzilla, which is a Showa Godzilla, but a little bit of a different design than what we'd anticipate to go against this Ghidorah. Legs scale up beautifully, so we can anticipate that when we do actually get more figures to go with this particular Ghidorah, they will scale up to be in this sort of slightly smaller 6-inch scale. These figures seem a little bit more smaller than the Heisei Ghidorahs, not Ghidorahs, Heisei Godzillas that they've been releasing since like the birth version and all of that, but still a fairly very standard size figure. So if we bring in the MonsterArts Mechagodzilla here, they scale up pretty well as well. So I think this is MonsterArts' new sort of scaling that they're doing for their Showa figures. They've really abandoned that 64 Mothra versus Godzilla scaling, which I'm happy about, but I do wish they would remake that Mothra versus Godzilla figure slightly bigger, so we could actually have him scale up with some of these other figures later on. But I would really love a late 1964 Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster Godzilla to go with this guy. That would be absolutely fantastic. So, in conclusion, I think that this figure is actually surprisingly decent. Same as with the 1991 special color version bootleg, they both surprised me in terms of their quality. Now, yes, they're both far from perfect, but considering the price that these things are going for, that they're basically, these are the large-scale MonsterArts figures, yet they're going for prices that are approximately the same as, say, one of the smaller, more conservatively priced MonsterArts figures. One's more in terms of this sort of scaling, whereas these sort of more massive ones usually go for a premium. I think this one's very worth it. Now, yes, he does have issues, he's not perfect. Paintwork, like I said, is probably my biggest one, actually, because, you know, he's inaccurately painted, and it may take some work to actually get him to look exactly like he would in the film. However, I would be perfectly happy to display him as is. It's not too different from the color he did have in the film. He, of course, was a bit more metallic, maybe a little more or a brighter yellowy tinge, but he wasn't a screaming glowing gold, kind of like the special color version Ghidorah either. So this isn't too far off. Quality-wise, like I said, it was surprising, especially the quality of the articulation and the way that the figure is just built, and the fact that nothing is really falling apart except for that one wing, which, like I said, I don't know why it decided to go crazy this review. I think it just wanted attention because I knew I was filming it, which is just bloody annoying, but generally if you leave it, it's completely fine. It's just bizarre to me that Bandai and Tamashii Nation's MonsterArts, they have not released any news about an upcoming figure like this. So to have a 1964 MonsterArts King Ghidorah figure in hand at this time is just absolutely amazing to me. I really love that, and if MonsterArts does actually, and if they do actually, when and if they put out a figure like this, I'm sure that they'll do a really great job of it. So I would really love to pick one up and compare the two. But God only knows when that'll happen. Like, they haven't even announced it, and once they announce something, it's quite a while until they even release that stuff. So it could be a very long time. With that said, I highly recommend this figure, actually. It is a really cool version of Ghidorah. Like, this, I might have a bit of a bias just because I'm a really big fan of the Showa films, and this Ghidorah in particular is one of my all-time favorite kaiju designs, and I think they brought him to life beautifully in this film, in this figure. And yeah, it just makes for a great display piece and a really cool thing that you can customize, and just a bizarre kind of figure, as the fact that we don't really know where it came from or have much of a backstory on it. But regardless, the fact that we can get our hands on this thing is just awesome, and like I said, I recommend it to you guys. And yeah, I want you guys to let me know what you think of this figure here, because it's interesting to hear your thoughts about this stuff. And yeah, that's it for this review. If you guys have any questions or comments, do leave them in the comments section below. It's always awesome when you do that. And if you have any questions, for example, about this little display that I've got going here, I actually have a series on my channel where I show you guys tutorials on how to build these sort of things, as well as review other building products and accessories and all manner of that sort of stuff, which is going pretty strongly. I haven't uploaded to it for a while, so I have a back catalog of videos on that are pretty interesting. So they're going to keep piling up. That's going to be awesome. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because there's going to be more awesome content coming up, and I really appreciate that you guys check this video out. So yeah, may all your vinyl be irradiated vinyl. Over and out!